January 1943, the North Atlantic is black and restless, rolling beneath a low winter sky. Wind scrapes across steel. Ice forms along the rails of an Allied escort vessel, cutting a narrow path through convoy lanes that have already swallowed thousands of men. Below deck, the ship smells of diesel fuel, damp wool, and boiled coffee. It is not a command center. It is the galley, a cramped room where a cook works by habit, not heroism. Peeling potatoes, scraping plates, collecting refuse into a dented metal bin. Above him, sonar pings echo through the hull. Slow, methodical. Somewhere beneath the waves, a German U-boat is listening to. On this night, scraps are not just waste. Vegetable peels, grease, tin fragments. All of it is carried topside and thrown into the freezing sea, disappearing into the dark water behind the ship. Minutes later, sonar operators report confusion. Ghost contacts. False depths. The underwater picture fractures. The escort turns. Depth charges are armed. What began as routine disposal has altered the underwater battlefield. Not by design, not by doctrine, but by accident. And in the silent war beneath the Atlantic, small changes decide who lives and who never surfaces again. That quiet moment only makes sense when we understand how the Atlantic became the most unforgiving battlefield of the Second World War. By the time the war reached its fourth year, the Atlantic Ocean had already claimed more lives than any single land campaign. It was not marked by front lines or flags, but by shipping lanes, invisible corridors stretching from North America to Britain, Africa, and the Soviet Union. Whoever controlled these corridors controlled the war's lifeline. Germany understood this early. When Britain declared war in September 1939, the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, knew it could not challenge the Royal Navy ship for ship. Battleships were few. Aircraft carriers were non-existent. The answer lay beneath the surface. Submarines, U-boats, cheap compared to capital ships, difficult to detect, and devastating against unescorted merchant traffic. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz built his strategy around this reality. He envisioned a war of attrition, measured not in victories but in tonnage sunk. If Britain could be starved of food, fuel, and raw materials, its industrial and military collapse would follow. The ocean would do the killing. Early success validated this belief. Between 1939 and 1941, German U-boats operated with near impunity across the Atlantic. Merchant ships sailed independently, often without escort. Detection technology was primitive. Depth charges were crude. Many Allied crews had never faced submarine attack before. The ocean favored the hunter. The U-boat crews developed a disciplined routine. Surface at night. Shadow convoys. Radio positions to command. Assemble wolf packs. Attack in coordinated strikes. Then vanish beneath the waves before escorts could react. Survivors described the terror of torpedoes arriving without warning, of black water swallowing lifeboats, of ships breaking apart in minutes. Allied losses mounted steadily. In 1940 alone, Britain lost over 4 million tons of shipping. Shipyards worked relentlessly to replace hulls faster than U-boats could destroy them, but production lagged behind destruction. Every sunk freighter represented lost food, lost fuel, lost war potential. By 1941, the Atlantic had become a contest of adaptation. The Allies began organizing convoys more systematically. Escort vessels, corvettes, destroyers, sloops, were tasked with shepherding merchant ships across vast distances. Yet numbers remained thin. Technology lagged. Crews were inexperienced. Life aboard these escort ships was exhausting and monotonous. Watches ran day and night. Sonar operators stared at flickering screens and listened to echoes that could mean steel hulls or nothing at all. Gunners drilled endlessly for attacks that might never come. Engineers fought cold, leaks, and vibration below deck, and there were others on board, men whose jobs had nothing to do with combat. Signalmen, stewards, medical orderlies, and cooks. These men were not trained to hunt submarines. They were trained to keep crews alive. Food mattered more than comfort in winter seas, where hypothermia could kill in minutes. A hot meal stabilized morale. Routine kept panic at bay. The cook's world was measured in rations and fuel, not bearings and depth charts. But on a warship, no task existed in isolation. Waste disposal followed strict procedures. Nothing could be allowed to clutter deck space. Refuse was thrown overboard at designated times, often at night, when the ship ran dark to avoid detection. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, U-boats listened. German submarines relied heavily on sound. Hydrophones detected propeller noise, cavitation, changes in water pressure. Crews learned to interpret these subtle signals with extraordinary precision. A single noise anomaly could mean an escort closing in or drifting away. As the war progressed, Allied escorts grew more aggressive, but they were still learning. Many early countermeasures failed. Sonar contacts were lost. Depth charges exploded too shallow or too deep. U-boats escaped again and again, often damaged but alive. This cycle created frustration and improvisation. Officers listened to junior sailors. Sonar operators compared notes. Engineers modified equipment. Small observations began to matter. And in this environment, where every man watched the water differently, something as ordinary as scraps thrown into the sea would soon intersect with a deadly technological race unfolding beneath the waves. BY 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered a dangerous middle phase. Germany expanded U-boat operations far beyond European waters. With the United States newly at war, the eastern seaboard of North America became a hunting ground. Coastal cities glowed at night, silhouetting merchant ships against illuminated shorelines. U-boats called it a second happy time. Allied losses surged again, but beneath the surface of these defeats, a transformation was underway. The Allies were no longer relying on a single solution. They were assembling a system, overlapping technologies, procedures, and human judgment, designed to close every gap a submarine could exploit. The early form of active sonar improved steadily. Operators learned to distinguish between seabed echoes, thermal layers, and moving steel hulls. Radar sets began detecting surfaced U-boats at night and in poor weather. High-frequency direction finding, HF/DF, known as HFDUF, allowed escorts to triangulate German radio transmissions in real time. Each advance narrowed the U-boat's margin for error. Depth charges evolved as well. Early models detonated at fixed depths, often missing targets entirely. Newer versions allowed crews to set multiple depths and patterns, creating underwater kill zones rather than single blasts. Hedgehog and squid weapons followed, projecting explosives ahead of the ship instead of dropping them blindly astern. Yet technology alone did not guarantee success. The Atlantic was a chaotic acoustic environment. Propeller wash, wave action, marine life, and thermal layers distorted sound. Sonar returns were fragile, easily lost. U-boats learned to exploit this, changing depth suddenly, hugging the seabed, or releasing decoys. Every engagement became a contest of interpretation rather than certainty. This uncertainty created space for unconventional thinking. Escort crews noticed patterns that manuals did not explain. Sonar contacts that broke apart without a clear maneuver. Echoes that multiplied briefly, then vanished. Moments when U-boats seemed to hesitate, unsure whether they had been detected. Waste disposal, long considered irrelevant to combat, entered these observations. When refuse was dumped overboard, sonar operators occasionally reported brief acoustic disturbances. Nothing dramatic, just confusion, clutter, a momentary degradation of the underwater picture, food scraps, grease, tin fragments. Even air trapped in refuse created bubbles and irregular returns as they sank. In isolation, these disturbances meant nothing. But in proximity to a submerged submarine, already under pressure and operating in silence, they complicated interpretation. German hydrophone operators faced similar challenges. They listened for escorts. They tried to map surface movements from sound alone. Any anomaly introduced doubt. Was the escort turning, accelerating, deploying weapons, or merely dumping waste? In U-boat warfare, hesitation was deadly. The Allies did not initially formalize this effect. There was no doctrine describing refuse as a countermeasure. But war rewards what works, not what is authorized. When escort commanders noticed that dumping waste sometimes coincided with sonar confusion, especially just before an attack, the practice spread quietly. It was not glamorous. It did not appear in communiques, but crews remembered results. The cook, meanwhile, remained responsible for timing and disposal. His routines intersected with sonar watches and attack patterns. In some crews, Waste dumping was delayed or accelerated to coincide with suspected contacts. The galley became unintentionally linked to the sonar room. German records later reflected growing anxiety. Patrol logs noted acoustic disturbances and uncertain contact conditions. U-boats reported increased difficulty tracking escorts once detected. The underwater battle space was no longer clean. It was noisy, deceptive, unpredictable. By late 1942 and early 1943, the balance began to tilt. Allied convoys became harder to penetrate. Escorts stayed with contacts longer. U-boats were forced deeper, slower, more cautious. Survivability declined. What had begun as isolated observations, scraps hitting water, echoes fracturing, became part of a larger pattern. The Atlantic was no longer a place where submarines dictated the fight. It was becoming a trap layered with human intuition, mechanical sensing, and small, almost invisible disruptions. And in that layered struggle, the meaning of a single act depended on the angle from which it was viewed. War at sea reduced individuals to functions. Sonar operator, helmsman, gunner, cook. Each man occupied a narrow lane inside a floating machine that never truly stopped moving. Fatigue blurred judgment. Cold stiffened hands. Routine became survival. For the cook, days were measured in rations and heat. Bread baked when fuel allowed. Coffee stretched thin. Food waste was unavoidable. Vegetable peelings. Congealed grease. Bent tins. Disposal followed regulation, but regulation bent under pressure. A convoy under threat altered everything on board. The cook heard depth charges through the hull, like everyone else. He felt the vibrations. He smelled cordite. He knew when men were tense. His job did not change, but his awareness did. When scraps went overboard at moments of heightened alert, results were noticed, not by him at first, but by those listening below. In this environment, credit mattered less than effect. No single man claimed invention. Knowledge spread sideways, passed quietly during watches and mess breaks. War made room for observations that would never survive peacetime scrutiny. Tactical angle. Confusion as a weapon. Anti-submarine warfare was not about destruction alone. It was about forcing mistakes. An escort ship rarely saw its enemy. The fight unfolded through sound. Bearings. Estimated ranges. Patterns drawn on plotting tables. Any disruption to that flow of information increased the chance of error. When refuse entered the water, it created transient acoustic clutter. Bubbles collapsed. Metal fragments fell irregularly. Grease altered surface turbulence. These effects did not mimic submarines, but they broke continuity. For a sonar operator, continuity was everything. Losing a clean contact forced recalculation. For a U-boat hydrophone operator, uncertainty meant slowing down, diving deeper, or altering course. Each choice reduced attack effectiveness. Depth charge attacks relied on prediction. A moment of confusion widened the gap between where the submarine was and where it would be when explosives detonated. That gap killed submarines. What mattered was not the scraps themselves, but timing. Waste dumped when a contact was already pressured magnified its impact. The tactic worked because it exploited stress, not because it replaced technology. Technological angle. Fragile sensor sonar in the early 1940s was powerful but delicate. Sound traveled differently through layers of water at different temperatures. Bubbles distorted returns. Objects did not fall uniformly. Operators learned through experience rather than manuals. They learned what false echoes felt like. They learned how quickly contact quality degraded under certain conditions. Scraps exploited that fragility. The Atlantic became a place where the smallest disturbances mattered. Technology did not fail, it revealed its limits. And in those limits, human intuition found space to act. The meaning of this would only become clear when German submarines began dying in numbers they could no longer replace. And from the other side of the war, those losses looked very different. Inside a German U-boat, silence was doctrine. Engines slowed to a crawl. Fans were shut down. Men spoke in whispers. Every unnecessary sound was considered a threat. The hydrophone operator sat with headphones pressed tight, isolating himself from the cramped steel cylinder around him, listening for escorts that might already be closing. By 1942, German crews had become highly skilled at acoustic interpretation. They could estimate range, speed, and even the number of ships from sound alone. But that skill depended on clarity. When the underwater soundscape fractured, confidence eroded quickly. Acoustic clutter, brief, irregular, directionless, created doubt. Escorts that seemed to change course suddenly. Noise that bloomed and vanished without explanation. These moments forced U-boat commanders to choose caution over aggression. Dive deeper. Break off pursuit. Delay an attack window that might never return. German patrol reports increasingly reflected this uncertainty. Phrases like contact conditions unclear and enemy behavior difficult to interpret appeared more frequently. Survivors later described a growing sense that escorts always seemed closer than expected, more persistent, less predictable. The hunter was no longer certain it was unseen. Leadership angle. When doctrine listens downward, naval doctrine traditionally flowed from the top. Admirals issued orders. Captains executed them. Junior sailors followed procedure. But anti-submarine warfare disrupted this hierarchy. No admiral could hear sonar returns from a pitching deck at night. No staff officer could feel the difference between clean and distorted contact in real time. Escort commanders learned to listen to experience, not rank. When sonar operators reported patterns they could not explain, officers paid attention. When junior crew noted that contact confusion followed certain actions, those actions were repeated. Not because they were approved, but because they worked. Leadership in this environment meant allowing adaptation. It meant tolerating informal tactics that did not yet have names. Waste disposal was never formalized as a weapon, but its effects were quietly integrated into attack rhythms. This flexibility distinguished Allied success late in the war. German command structures, by contrast, remained rigid. Tactical freedom aboard U-boats narrowed as losses mounted. Commanders were pressured to attack even when conditions felt wrong. The Atlantic rewarded the side that learned faster. Moral angle. Improvisation and survival. There was no romance in these encounters. Men drowned unseen. Steel hulls imploded. Victory came without witnesses. Improvisation did not feel clever. It felt necessary. The cook did not see submarines sink. He did not hear screams or explosions beyond dull vibrations. His contribution existed at the edge of awareness. Yet war magnifies the impact of ordinary acts when systems intersect. This raised uncomfortable truths. Survival did not belong solely to heroes or innovators. It belonged to those who noticed small things and acted without certainty. Ethics bent toward outcome. If scraps increased confusion, they were used. If confusion killed, that became acceptable. By early 1943, the consequences of these accumulated adaptations were about to become undeniable. Convoys that once bled freely now fought back. U-boats that once slipped away now failed to escape. The Atlantic was reaching a moment where pressure, technology, and human improvisation would collide, not gradually, but violently. In a series of encounters that changed the war beneath the waves, that collision would arrive without warning, measured in minutes and depth settings rather than speeches or declarations. March 1943 marked the peak of the Battle of the Atlantic and the beginning of its reversal. Convoys HX and SC, slow and heavily laden, pushed eastward through the North Atlantic under constant threat. German command committed dozens of U-boats to intercept them. The wolf packs assembled along predicted routes, forming lines of steel across hundreds of miles of open water. On the surface, Allied escorts were stretched thin. Fuel was rationed. Crews were exhausted. But something had changed in how these ships fought. During one-night engagement, sonar contact was gained shortly after midnight. Sea state was rough. Visibility was poor. The escort maintained steady speed to preserve sonar clarity. The contact was weak but persistent. A submarine running deep and slow, attempting to evade while tracking the convoy. The order came quietly. Maintain contact. Do not rush the attack. As the ship turned slightly to refine bearing. Waste disposal was conducted as part of routine. Scraps went overboard aft, breaking the surface briefly before vanishing. Within minutes, sonar reported degradation in the contact. The Echo fractured, then reappeared offset from its previous track. The escort adjusted course. From the U-boat's perspective, hydrophone returns became unreliable. The escort's movement could not be plotted cleanly. Was it turning toward them or away? Speed estimates conflicted. Depth control became conservative. The commander delayed surfacing for a better look. That delay proved fatal. The escort closed the gap. A depth charge pattern was set, not a single drop, but a layered spread designed to box in a target that might change depth suddenly. The charges entered the water with muted splashes, followed by the long, suspended seconds before detonation. Explosions rolled through the water column. The ship shuddered. Sonar contact vanished, then briefly returned. Distorted, shallow, unstable. Another attack followed. Elsewhere along the convoy routes, similar patterns unfolded. Escorts held contact longer. U-boats hesitated more often. Depth charge accuracy improved not because explosives were smarter, but because prediction windows narrowed. German losses climbed sharply in March and May 1943. Patrol areas once considered safe became lethal. Boats that survived returned damaged, shaken, and increasingly cautious. The decisive shift was not announced. There was no single battle. But for the men involved, the sense was unmistakable. The Atlantic had turned hostile to submarines. And in the minutes after explosions faded, when the sea surface settled back into darkness, confirmation arrived quietly. Debris, oil, air bubbles rising where no ship should be. Yet the full realization of what had happened would come only after repeated encounters proved this was not chance. That it was a system working. By late spring 1943. The pattern was undeniable that U-boats were being detected earlier, tracked longer, and destroyed more frequently than at any previous point in the war. In May alone, Germany lost 41 submarines, an unsustainable rate. Entire crews vanished without sending a final report. Patrol lines dissolved as boats were recalled or diverted. In individual engagements, the sequence repeated with lethal consistency. A contact gained. Pressure maintained. Confusion introduced. Attack executed. Escort logs show increasing confidence. Sonar operators trusted degraded contacts rather than abandoning them. Commanders adjusted depth charge settings dynamically, anticipating evasive dives. Surface radar prevented nighttime escapes. Air cover closed the gaps that once allowed submarines to surface safely. Within this system, small actions amplified one another. Waste disposal, time to moments of tactical engagement, became part of a broader rhythm, never decisive alone, but reinforcing pressure. It forced submarines to react rather than act. German commanders recognized the shift too late. Admiral Donitz admitted in post-war reflections that the U-boat arm had been defeated not by a single invention, but by the accumulation of many. Improved escort tactics, air coverage, radar, sonar, and the loss of acoustic invisibility that once protected submarines. Survivor testimony spoke of a sea that no longer behaved as expected. Escorts appeared to cling to boats. Attacks followed even when contact seemed lost. Submarines could no longer disengage cleanly. The ocean itself felt hostile. When a U-boat was destroyed, there was rarely spectacle. A dull underwater concussion, a momentary rise of oil, occasionally wreckage, then silence. For Allied crews, confirmation came slowly. Oil slicks persisted. Air bubbles ceased. Sonar returned nothing but empty water. The kill was logged. The convoy moved on. There was no celebration. Losses were still heavy. The sea remained indifferent. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The Atlantic was no longer dominated by unseen hunters. It had become a layered defense, where every sound, every shadow, every scrap mattered. The cook returned to his galley. Meals were prepared. Waste collected. The routine continued, unchanged in appearance. But beneath the surface, that routine had intersected with technology and timing in a way that altered outcomes. By mid-1943, Germany withdrew most U-boats from the North Atlantic. The tonnage war was lost. Allied shipping began to outpace destruction decisively. Supply lines stabilized. The invasion of Europe became logistically possible. The turning point did not belong to one man or one moment. It belonged to a system that absorbed small insights and turned them into survival. What followed was not relief, but reckoning. The months following the Atlantic turning point were marked by absence. Patrol zones once crowded with U-boats grew quiet. Convoys still sailed under guard, but attacks became sporadic rather than constant. The sense of imminent threat, the expectation of sudden torpedoes, slowly receded. For the Allies, the immediate consequence was logistical freedom. Merchant losses dropped sharply after May 1943. Shipbuilding programs in the United States and Britain began to outpace sinkings by wide margins. For the first time since the war began, material flowed across the ocean faster than it could be destroyed. Escort doctrine evolved to reflect hard-earned lessons. Crews emphasized persistence over aggression. Contacts were held even when clarity faded. Attack patterns assumed deception and confusion as standard conditions, not anomalies. Training incorporated unpredictability rather than clean textbook scenarios. None of this was attributed to scraps or refuse officially. Naval reports focused on technology and coordination, radar ranges, sonar improvements, air coverage. But beneath the language of formal evaluation lay an understanding that the Atlantic had become a hostile sensory environment for submarines. German command struggled to respond. New U-boat designs promised higher underwater speeds and longer submerged endurance. Acoustic countermeasures were deployed, but these arrived too late and in too few numbers to reverse the trend. Crews faced mounting psychological strain. Patrols stretched longer. Survival rates plummeted. Young sailors with minimal training replaced veterans who never returned. The ocean no longer offered concealment, only delay. Intelligence reports confirmed what escorts already felt. Intercepted communications revealed German concern over detection persistence. Commanders complained that escorts would not break off and that evasion tactics failed repeatedly. This persistence defined the new Atlantic War. On-board Allied ships, routine remained unchanged in appearance. Watches rotated. Meals were cooked. Waste was disposed of. Yet every action occurred within a system now optimized to deny submarines certainty. The war at sea had become less dramatic and more lethal. And as the immediate crisis passed, the long-term consequences began to reshape the remainder of the conflict. The long-term impact of the Atlantic reversal extended far beyond shipping statistics. It reshaped strategy, morale, and the very nature of naval warfare. For Germany, the loss of the U-boat arm was not merely tactical, it was existential. Submarines had been the Kriegsmarine's primary offensive weapon. With their effectiveness broken, Germany lost its ability to influence the war beyond coastal waters. The Atlantic became an Allied-controlled highway rather than a contested battleground. Attempts to recover initiative failed. Advanced submarines, such as the Type XXI, promised revolutionary underwater performance. But production delays, Allied bombing, and the collapse of industrial infrastructure prevented meaningful deployment. By the time prototypes appeared, the war had moved on. For U-boat crews, the psychological toll was severe. Survival rates dropped below 50%, among the highest casualty rates of any service branch in the war. Veterans described a growing sense of inevitability. Patrols were undertaken with the expectation of detection. Confidence eroded. Initiative vanished. Allied crews experienced a different transformation. Confidence grew, but so did professionalism. Anti-submarine warfare became methodical rather than reactive. Escorts worked in coordinated groups, sharing contacts, rotating attacks, and denying escape routes. Improvisation remained central. The Atlantic had taught commanders that rigid doctrine failed in dynamic environments. Small observations, accumulated over time, produced decisive advantage. Not every contribution was visible or acknowledged, but each mattered. The cook's actions were never recorded in official histories. His name did not appear in after-action reports. Yet his routine existed inside a system that rewarded disruption, confusion, and pressure. By late 1944, the Atlantic was no longer a battlefield, it was infrastructure. Millions of men, vehicles, and tons of supplies crossed safely in preparation for the invasion of Europe. The war's outcome depended on this flow. The ocean had been tamed not by one weapon, but by a mindset. And when the war ended, the lessons remained. Quiet, uncelebrated, but enduring. The Battle of the Atlantic was never decided by a single invention or a single moment of brilliance. It was decided by accumulation, of pressure, of learning, of small actions layered until escape became impossible. History remembers radar, sonar, and aircraft. It remembers admirals and engineers. But war is lived at a lower level, inside routines repeated until they intersect with consequence. The Atlantic was shaped as much by habit as by strategy. The cook did not set out to fight submarines. He followed procedure. He adapted when conditions demanded it. His actions mattered not because they were heroic, but because they existed inside a system that learned to value disruption over perfection. Modern warfare often celebrates decisive blows. The Atlantic teaches a different lesson. Victory can emerge from persistence rather than spectacle, from denying the enemy clarity rather than overwhelming them with force. German submariners entered the war believing the ocean would protect them. It did, until it didn't. Once uncertainty replaced invisibility, once every sound became suspect, survival turned into chance rather than skill. The Allied victory at sea made everything else possible. Without it, armies would have starved, aircraft would have sat idle, and invasions would never have left their harbors. The ocean decided the war before it was fought on beaches or in cities. When the Atlantic finally grew quiet, it held the remains of thousands of ships and tens of thousands of men. It kept no record of rank or role, only outcomes. In that silence, the story of scraps thrown into dark water reminds us that history often turns on what seems insignificant at the time. Not because small acts win wars alone, but because they reveal how wars are truly won, not by a single hand, but by systems that learn to notice everything.